So today, as the title notes, we're going to talk about redefining real-world data. Real-world data is a concept that a lot of people are talking about right now, and I think that it can be nebulous in terms of what we mean when we talk about it, and what does it mean for our life sciences, pharmaceutical companies, and med device companies, and how they can use it. I know I already had a great introduction here, so I won't spend time belaboring this slide, but just a note that really I kind of come to this particular area thinking about the problem through the lens of both medical claims, history of working with our customers to solve problems in population health and care and case management, and bringing in my background in epidemiology and public health. So thinking a bit about kind of what we're going to talk about today, I do want to start with a little bit of information about LexisNexis. I find that there are oftentimes either a lack of information about who we are and what we do, or potentially an awareness of one part of our business that can make it hard to connect the dots with our presence in real-world data and in healthcare. So I'll talk briefly about LexisNexis, but the bulk of our time is going to be talking about what we mean when we say there's an evolution in real-world data. Where are we going and where are we coming from? And thinking about how that taps into a conversation about the patient journey and really expanding our mind's eye around what the patient journey can mean and if we should be considering the journey of the whole person. And finally, we'll talk about data tokenization and how a new capability and new approach to tokenization really unlocks pulling these pieces together in a meaningful way for you and your business. So talking about LexisNexis Risk Solutions, we are a large organization with a mission and a vision that crosses organizational lines in terms of, what parts of the business that we're solving for our customers. But across all of them, a common thread is around our vision to inspire insightful decisions and evaluate hidden risks. And I think that particular statement really applies here when we think about real-world data, right? What are the hidden risks that we are, unable to evaluate when we consider our patient populations and how they how they respond to drugs or, their healthcare situations? Tying that into the LexisNexis healthcare business, we have an overall mission around enabling the U.S. healthcare system to operate better and create healthier communities. And when we tie that into really what we do every day, it's coming from a driving passion around leveraging data and analytics to create connections, connecting patients, providers, healthcare organizations, and health systems in meaningful ways. That enables everyone to operate more effectively and make changes in our healthcare environment. When we look at what we do through the lens of data and analytics, I think it's important to think about the data assets that LexisNexis has and how we bring those to bear to help customers assess risk and opportunity. We're talking here about vast data resources, really amounts of data that are pretty hard for me to conceptualize when we talk about 12 petabytes of content. We're talking about bringing together information on, public records, proprietary and private data sources, a lot of other pieces of information that can be brought together on our big data technology and linked together with our advanced linking techniques to create a comprehensive and unique view of the individual. Layered on top of that, we have analytics and insight capabilities that allow us to drive these solutions into different problems for our customer base. Right, we're talking about helping our customers solve master data management and provider data problems. We talk about helping our customers solve business intelligence problems. I mentioned helping our customers solve their problems in population health and patient care and case management. So really deploying those insights in various ways to address industry-specific problems. And finally, really bringing industry expertise to bear on those problems so that we're employing professionals to help raise the bar and drive the value forward for our customers. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this at a high level because I think driving into what we do and the focus that LexisNexis has on data and on solutions that are oriented around data, the first thing that we've been thinking about when it comes to real-world data and to different data assets within healthcare in particular is this question of connectivity. So I raised in a prior slide the comment that we're passionate about leveraging data and analytics to make those connections. But I think we all know that there are barriers to doing that. right? In our industry in particular, there is sensitivity. We know that privacy and data protection are paramount when it comes to both protecting our security and protecting the privacy of patients for whom we have data that we want to protect. There's legislation that specifically limits and controls the ways in which that data can be protected and used. We know that within our companies, we have siloed access to data. You might have a data set that even within your organization, it can be difficult to gain access, or it can be difficult to have an awareness of what data is available because the use cases can be different. There are tactical system and technology limitations that can make data sharing hard, especially when we talk about the amount of data available and linking it together in ways that are consistent and reliable. And finally, I think this may actually be most important of all when we think about our patient populations, are the perceptions of the ways in which this data is used, right? We know that a lot of us are focused on being good stewards of this information, on building trust with patients and building trust that we are using data in ways to improve their experience. And that can sometimes weigh on us when we're making decisions about what data to use, how to connect it, and how to kind of move forward. So in a world with barriers to making meaningful connections, real world data is coming into the forum and being talked about in a way that, it might be a solution or a panacea to helping to solve certain problems in expanding evidence beyond the clinical trial, but we still need to contend with the barriers and overcome some of those difficulties in making connections. So I want to jump into really what this means for real world data. When we talk about an evolution in real world data, really we're driving toward where are we coming from and where are we going? So to lay a foundation that we're all speaking the same language, when I talk about real world data here, I'm describing information that typically happens outside of or after a clinical trial. And I think for many years now, we've thought about this in our industry as data that is synonymous with claims, now more clinical or EHR data that's helping to kind of augment your view of a patient's medical or clinical experience. It'll often, continue to evolve. So the fact that we, include EHR data in this is obviously driven by the presence of EHR data and the availability of that data. And as other data assets become available, so will our view of this change. A few years ago, the availability of, say, images was something that felt out of reach, and it's becoming more and more available. When we think about real world evidence, just kind of to make sure, again, that we're speaking from the same playbook here, we're talking about the insights and findings that are built upon the analysis of that real world data. And there's obviously no limit to what that can kind of contend and what that can include. So individuals who are, building their analytics teams and resources, I think there are some problems that are consistent across the industry that we're trying to solve, but there are also a lot of different and creative ways that we can layer the evidence together to build more insights. So one final point I want to raise here, and I think this drives toward the direction that we are going, right? So we talk about claims data, clinical data, EHR data, but individual level data assets are not limited to the medical or clinical experience. And increasingly, we're seeing these considered as sources of real world data that can add a lot of value to real world evidence and analysis. And what I mean when I say individual level data assets, it really can run the gamut, right? Individual level data can tell you about my consumer behavior. It can tell you about who I live with. It can tell you about my opinions. This can include, patient-reported outcomes. It can include survey data. It can run the gamut in terms of what is potentially considered here. But we have some really good guidance from our friends and the regulatory body at the FDA around what type of data we should be thinking about as we start to move from, what has been thought of traditionally as real-world data and into the next phase of where we think real-world data can go and what the regulatory bodies are saying are really worthy of consideration immediately. So here I'm specifically calling out some comments that FDA made in the fall of 2021 and when they made recommendations around use of real-world data and support regulatory decision making. So there was the draft document that I'm sure many folks on the line have been exposed to. And I just wanted to call out a few things here. Of course, they talk in that document about things like the population size and creating a good population size to have a lot of confidence in the result of your effect sizes. They talk about the ability to have history and looking back at someone's claims and clinical experience. So they comment on the kind of core of real world data. But beyond that, they start to talk about concepts that really drive into the individual level data that I want to talk more about today. When they comment on confounders and effect modifiers, they think about considering linkages to other data sources, additional data collection that could be done to expand the capture of important confounders. And they specifically are commenting on ones that might be unmeasured in traditional data sources or imperfectly measured. They comment on using those for both controlling for confounding as well as considering potential effect modifiers. And I think this comment really resonated with me, the idea that they can be used to better understand the heterogeneity of treatment effect. I think one of the key things that we know real world data is being used for already and that we expect to see expand is this idea of understanding the different effects that are observed during a clinical trial through a lens that can create a broader picture about the individual. And I think in this area, we really want to expand on what types of data can help to address some of those confounders and to examine effect modifiers. So specifically, I want to talk about social determinants of health data today. I think many folks are aware of research that's been done over this last, couple of decades, and in particular when social determinants were introduced in healthy people initiatives over the last few years. The idea that medical and clinical experience is only one part of the personal experience. In addition, of course, you have behavioral impacts, and finally, social factors. And researchers found that social factors can account for over 1 in 3 deaths in the United States annually. And social factors is, of course, a very large category. What that means for our research and for our decision making is, still to be determined. But Healthy People defines the 5 core domains of social determinants of health as healthcare access and quality, and that's the access part of this is something that I think a lot of our existing real world data contends with in terms of history of points of care and things like that. But the other 4 domains are really largely unexamined when we think about data assets within real world data. So looking at education, looking at economic stability, looking at the social and community context, and examining neighborhood and the built environment as potential contributors to health factors is really the lens through which we want to start to examine how social determinants of health data could help to add value to confounders and effect modifiers. And this isn't just a theory, right? We have research that identifies really specific ways in which social determinants of health factors have been linked to disparate health outcomes or patterns in healthcare. These ones are all pulled specifically from different studies around oncology and cancer cases and how social determinants were determined to have an effect. So you can see here, lower income has been significantly associated with survival rates in head and neck cancer patients. There are reports that say that advanced stage at diagnosis is associated with longer travel time to access healthcare. So, does that tell you that the longer you have to travel, the more likely it is you might put off those earlier visits? Potentially. These are the types of things that our social determinants of health data can help understand. Looking at how lower household income is associated with lower enrollment rates in clinical trials. More and more, we have discussions around representativeness and having an understanding of a heterogeneous population in a clinical trial is an important way to help assess some of these differences and mitigate disparate health outcomes. Cancer fatality rates have been associated with lower levels of education, and rural breast cancer patients have been found to be less likely to receive radiotherapy. So these are just a couple of examples of cases in which social determinants of health factors are associated in the research with different outcomes or different treatment patterns. And you can see how this kind of compounds because it enables, if we're not measuring it in real world data, and if we're not considering the ways in which it could have an impact, we're going to be limited in our ability to have an effect on these outcomes. So we talked about the FDA's recommendation around confounders and effect modifiers, but next I want to talk a little bit about mortality. I think it's pretty familiar to everyone that mortality as a potential outcome is an important thing to be measuring and to be aware of. And I also think it's pretty well known that our traditional medical data assets don't do a great job of capturing this information. So according to the FDA, they comment on the fact that for studies that have an outcome interest that includes fatal outcomes, if we exclude patients who appear lost to follow-up at any time, it is likely to create bias. It's a pretty simple sentence, but it's very meaningful, right? So the fact that an individual appears lost to follow-up can, of course, be related to simply being, leaving the trial or being outside of the scope of the data that's available. It could also mean that there was, a mortality event that was uncaptured in the EHR or claims data, and that event then is now being removed from both the numerator and the denominator of your study. When we think about kind of what's been shared in the industry already, right, 35% of deaths are believed to be missing from EHR fields. And I think, that's understandable, right? Considering the purpose for which that data serves, an EHR is not likely to go back in and update, even if someone, is notified of a death, because that EHR record is associated with that clinical experience. Similarly, a medical claim, right? The purpose of that medical claim is to ensure payment for the provider and processing for the health plan. That medical claim isn't likely to need to capture a deceased status unless that's, considered a potential flag for fraudulent activity. So anything that happens outside of the health system potentially is missing from our traditional data assets that we would think of within real-world data. And there are solutions to this that are already in use. I'm not trying to ignore that, but some of the traditional ones, including the National Death Index, have a pretty significant lag. There's been more and more use of the Social Security Death Index and some challenges with that data asset as well. In addition to some potential lag, there also has recently been some suppressed records in that file due to some fraudulent behavior. So there is potential for gaps to exist there as well. And I really just bring this up because I think a comprehensive source of mortality data is an important potential measure here. Nobody wants to be thinking about the impact that could be having in terms of a patient's life, but the inability to measure that and to effectively integrate that data into your study could really create a hole that can bias the end results. So the FDA issued other recommendations as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about some additional ones in the presentation in just a moment. But having talked through confounders, effect modifiers, and mortality, I wanted to bring us to a conversation about the patient and the person. So what do I mean when I say the patient and the person? So in particular, we talk a lot in pharma about the patient journey, and we think about what that means kind of in terms of their medical experience. So I'm going to ask you to kind of come along with me for a little bit of a story and think about kind of what your role would be if you were involved at a pharma company with research efforts. So imagine that your company is processing an endocrine therapy for ER-positive breast cancer cases. Initial clinical trial results are demonstrating fewer side effects than competing products and existing products in the market. And you're seeing similar outcomes, but it's kind of minimal positive effect, nothing that's statistically significant in your initial examination above and beyond the standard of care. But the fact that you have fewer side effects is meaningful. Of course, your company has spent a large investment on these clinical trials and the product development, and currently the standard of care has been around so long that it's a generic, so your product is going to be more expensive than the standard of care. So, excuse me, I zoomed ahead here. There we go. So you can imagine that there's going to be work to be done thinking about positioning and educating the market on your product. As someone working in the analysis within the HEOR team, you're going to be contributing to the body of evidence that helps to support reimbursement structures, helping to identify the relevant patient populations for focused treatment with your product. You're going to be driving internal and external communication, working on positioning the product, educating providers on its benefits, and more. And ultimately, I think the question here when we think about the patient journey is, what are the kind of key questions that we are asking of the data to inform our analysis? And is the data giving us the information that we need? Would understanding more about the person have an impact on our potential results? So if we take a look at the patient journey and from the lens of the medical and clinical experience that we're all sort of used to thinking of, here we have a streamlined version, because only so many bubbles will fit on a slide, but a streamlined version that's meant to represent kind of a patient's experience through the medical system. And in this case, this is a patient who had a very kind of relatively healthy childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. Probably some standard doctor visits that I'm missing from this journey because I didn't want to add too many more bubbles. But goes through the stages of life, early in life, relatively straightforward. You can see, in kind of later midlife, prior to menopause, there is a breast cancer diagnosis. And of course, that would come with subsequent treatment visits and additional medical events as well. A few years later, there's actually a recurrence of that breast cancer, followed by spread of the cancer to the liver, and a few years later, death. So from the perspective of the medical and clinical perspective, you see that there are several events, and this probably looks on its surface like a potentially standard experience. The patient was offered standard of care treatments. The patient was able to go into remission for a few years, and unfortunately, the patient saw a recurrence, which is not particularly common, but not unexpected. The point trying to raise here is really just that this is what we see when we're examining the patient's experience through the lens of the clinical and medical data available. But I want to take you on a little bit different of a journey next. So here, we're looking at the journey of the individual person. You'll notice, there's a lot of different events on this one, so we'll walk through them for a moment. In this case, we're talking about an individual named Jane Smith. Jane Smith had, as we noted on the other slide, a relatively normal and healthy adolescence and young adulthood. She went to a 2-year college, graduated, got her first job, renter's insurance for her apartment. She buys a car. Unfortunately, she loses that first job, loses with that some of her economic stability, and winds up evicted from her first apartment. Luckily, she was young, and she decided to kind of go back to school and try to determine a way forward to improve her situation. She met and married a partner and wound up graduating with her 4-year degree. With her partnership as well as with her 4-year degree, she's in a more stable situation with her career. Her income increases, and they buy their first home. They decide to start a family and have some children, and kind of go through midlife raising their family. They wind up divorcing, and as she prioritizes her work and her economic stability, she winds up having to move for her job and winds up further away from social and community support. She later on winds up with some vision issues, losing her driver's license and limiting her transportation and increasing her isolation. And at the end of her life, she has died. You'll also notice, because her marriage was captured in there, that we also have reflected that she's changed her name. So now she is Jane Jones. So what does this tell you on its own? Maybe not much if you're thinking about this through the lens of real world data and the diverse experiences that individuals can have. But if we layer in their clinical experiences, it starts to tell a lot more. So you can see those early in life visits, the experiences they have with the medical system when they're relatively healthy and no major concerns, layer into different phases of their life. But now the breast cancer diagnosis comes in the midst of raising a family and potentially in the midst of some trouble in her marriage. So what does that mean for her kind of ability to manage that care and treatment? The recurrence comes even later, and maybe what we don't see here reflected, but what the clinical and medical data might tell you is that while she was recommended a 5-year course of endocrine treatment for her breast cancer diagnosis, maybe it was incomplete. Maybe with other things happening in her life, it interrupted her care. Again, you see the spread of her diagnosis coming later in life, followed by not being able to drive anymore, could have impacted her ability to provide her own follow-up care, get to appointments, things like that. Excuse me. So the important thing I just want to make sure is resonating from this view of the individual is thinking through the intersection between a person's personal experiences and their medical and clinical experiences can be really impactful. If we take a look through the individual lens, you can think through some of our more traditional use cases, right? Of course, if you are the individual's doctor and you have visibility into these types of challenges, you can offer different supports, you can make different decisions. But even through the lens of aggregate research, understanding some of these potential barriers in the population and how they could evolve into disparate impacts could be really impactful to the analysis that we're doing. And thinking about these life events as a normal course of analysis and research rather than as the exception is a way that we can evolve real-world data and real-world evidence to tell us more about the individual and really drive for a broader viewpoint and additional value. But now I want to talk for a second about how we actually accomplish this. What do we have available in our toolkit that enables us to go from the view of the clinical and claims experience on the medical side of the individual and their personal or identity information about the events in their lives? And here enter tokenization. So I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with data tokenization in healthcare to help support de-identified use cases, right? Tokenization enables us to view sensitive data elements without revealing the identity of the individual. It's a way in which we can support data sharing under HIPAA compliance regulations for expert determination and de-identification. And it opens up a lot of different analyses we can do with data that continue to allow us to have individual level insight, even if it's not tied back to an identified person. But that's not just what's happening in the industry. FDA has some thoughts about this, as you think they probably would, right? So data linking is a concept that has been commented on in this recent publication. And they talk about the different options for data linking, as well as the ways in which to consider the potential impacts of your different approaches. So in the draft recommendations, they talk about probabilistic and deterministic approaches to data linkage, which can result in different linkage quality and really which can be applied differently in different use cases. And they're not saying here that only one is good. They're saying you have to consider the impacts of using one over the other and how that's going to impact the data and what you can do with it. They're also talking about the existence of multiple records of the same person at different sites. So consider that when you link together clinical data, you're thinking about records across several health systems, and the same patient could have been treated at several health systems. And if you're leveraging something like their own internal identifier that's been de-identified, you're going to lose the ability to correctly link those records together across different sites, which could yield overcounting of a particular data measure or particular person in that population. So, of course, the document goes further and goes into more detail, but I called out those as some highlights because I think these are relevant considerations when we're thinking about how to pull together different data assets and how to do so with a high degree of confidence in the precision and accuracy of our end results. So I want to talk for a minute about kind of where tokenization sits today and what the industry has come to expect. So today we have a lot of solutions that are driven based on observed input PII data to create a unique de-identified patient token. And these methods are enhanced with different statistical techniques that can create weights for naming and enhance the probabilistic matching. But we know these techniques are only as good as kind of the input information, right? So in this example on the top of the table here, you can see that in the identified data asset, there's Jane Smith and Janet Smith. They share an address and a date of birth, which for many, would, given the fact that their names are so close together, would indicate that they are likely the same individual. But actually, they are twin sisters. So for good reason, they share a date of birth and an address. But one thing they don't share is their medical condition. So Jane Smith is the individual that we followed on her journey. She winds up with a breast cancer diagnosis while her twin sister does not. So linking together these data assets in a de-identified manner gives you an indication that these two are the same record when they are not, which can impact your actual results. In addition, again, tying back to the comments from FDA, it's not only that you could create a link where one doesn't exist, you could also miss pieces of information about the individual. So you'll notice lines 3 and 4 of the table are not linked together on token A at all. Those are actually links on the same person. Jane Smith moves to 123 Oak, and later in life, Jane Smith gets married, changes her name to Jane Jones. These are the same person, but the probabilistic matching technique does not link them together because of the distance to the zip code and the different last name. So you can see that it creates an imperfect and incomplete view of the individual. LexisNexis has a capability that enables us to add referential data and value to the linking process to create the next generation token solution. So I talked earlier on in the presentation about the work LexisNexis has done to bring together petabytes of data and to link them in a representative, consistent, and highly accurate way. And we're bringing that capability to bear here in a de-identified solution. So you can see now Jane Smith in row 1, and Jane Smith in row 3, and Jane Jones in row 4 are accurately and correctly linked together on a common token. We're able to resolve that data not because a probabilistic matching technique thinks they should represent the same person. It's not that they probably are close together or their names are quite similar. It's that we have actual records in an identified fashion that tell us in a deterministic way that these are the same individual. You can see also that the process correctly separates the record for Janet Smith, her twin sister, onto its own record. And finally, there's an additional record that is not linked and is an intentionally different person. Of course, Jane Smith is a common name, so it would be inaccurate to represent only 2 of them, right? The intent here is to demonstrate that you can create a higher fidelity and higher confidence record in a de-identified fashion that allows you to have consistency over time and accuracy in the links that you're creating. And on this slide, we're really just demonstrating what happens within a single data set in a single point in time. But you can imagine, if you expand beyond this, the value when you're thinking about data that changes across data sets and over time. So let's think about real data for the real world, right? We live in a world of complex data and in a real world with people living messy lives that change a lot. And that's reflected in the information that we see. So data is constantly changing. We see that 24% of US adults move within a 5-year period. 1.3 million of those are out-of-state moves. And if a lot of our probabilistic matching techniques examine location as part of their ability to accurately match, that's going to have a major impact. In addition, we see 2 million marriages a year, and some subset, of course not all, will involve a name change. Since name is likely to be an input to creating a token, the name changes could yield different tokens in any situation. And a probabilistic technique is going to depend on some amount of consistency. So if my name changes, like our Janes did from Jane Jones to Jane Smith, those are both very common names. And there's going to be, a lot of candidates for having that name in the pile in the data that's available. Excuse me. So how does LexisNexis come at solving this problem? Well, we took a look at the experience and expertise that we have. I mentioned earlier on, we've been working at this problem in an identified fashion, solving data linkage problems, and we have over 40 years of experience working in that space. And that includes, solving problems in driving industry-leading data solutions. And here I'm not just talking about within healthcare either. These are data solutions that are highly sensitive and that are put under intense scrutiny. So situations in which the identity data would be not only improved, but put to the test repeatedly to ensure that our solution is robust enough to meet the need. That data that we've captured accounts for over 5 billion permutations of personally identifiable information observed across 280 million adult identities. So 5 billion different combinations of my name, my location, and the different identities that I've had over my life. And I don't mean identities like I've been changing my identity, but right, I'm married, I have a married name and a maiden name. Maybe sometimes I put my middle name or middle initial on a form. You can imagine that creates a lot of different data that needs to be linked together, and that can create different tokens if you're looking at input token situations. When we look at leveraging our referential data set and the impact it has on tokenization solutions, we've performed our own tests to examine how data would be different and the tokenization value that is added by referential data. And we've found results that are up to 20% improvement in our ability to deduplicate records, meaning identifying that the same individual exists where two different tokens would previously have been created based on the input PII. But also that our data is really driving toward, in particular, even stronger impacts when we look at that information over time. So if the data set in question has 12 months of data, there is less variation in input PII than if you're looking at 5 years or even more history on an individual. And all of this really drives toward a result that enables kind of improved precision and match rates that are improved not only over time, but across data sets. The across data sets piece is highly important here when we think about the task ahead of us to bring together disparate data sources, understanding a patient in an EHR or EMR, understanding patient claims information. These are ways in which the data can look different, and we need to be able to span those differences and solve the problem together. And lastly, when we think about kind of the longitudinally comprehensive patient-centric token, this seems like a unique time when we're bringing together these data sets to solve real-world data and real-world evidence problem, and the solution is enabling that in a way that today's first-generation token solutions are simply not capable of doing. So how does this really kind of power your integration? I mentioned the point regarding driving across data sets and over time, and I think this slide really demonstrates that with a better effect. So you're looking at information, potentially data partners that you're pursuing that have their own input data. You're looking at the input information from LexisNexis, the identified information in these driver's license slots that identify the individual and that help us to track their changes of address, their change of marital status or name, the things that tie into creating that de-identified patient-centric token. Linking together across that, you can also tie in our social determinants of health data, our mortality reference file, and create on top of all of these assets a comprehensive view of an individual. Jane Smith is the identified patient in question, but in your data analysis, it would be represented as a token with the identity protected, but with a continuous identity throughout and across all of the data sets in question. So let's think for a minute about the discussion that we've had here around the recommendation, think about the FDA's guidance, and think about the capabilities that we've discussed. I think driving toward a world in which we are all considering more than claims and clinical data within real-world data is inevitable. But what it is that we consider and how we put it to use is where we are in a position to have an impact. So, of course, that's going to include other medical and behavioral data elements, but it can also include data assets that allow us to view the whole person and allow us to understand what could be leading to disparate results and to a different effect or efficacy size in our data. We talked about leveraging social determinants of health, deceased and mortality data to help really expand your view of the approach and of the individual. And importantly here, I think it's tying back to this point that we need to have the ability to measure in order to make an impact. Anything that is unmeasured or imperfectly measured in the data that we're using today is going to limit our ability to understand it and to have an impact on it. And we talked about person-centered tokenization, the ability to use improved precision and longitudinality to bring together data assets in a de-identified way that helps to examine the whole person's experience. And let's think about sort of what this means, right? We talked about the story about you working on a product for your company and examining the data in question. The results of that analysis can drive a lot of things in the industry. We talked about it driving communication strategy and pricing discussions, but it can also drive things like decision support tools. The analysis may identify that someone for whom transportation is a challenge is going to be less likely to have a positive outcome on your drug. And that could mean that the decision support tools could be crafted in such a way to help identify that barrier and offer a service to mitigate that barrier, thus improving the effectiveness of your product for those patients. When we think about the way that these tools can kind of add value into the design process, it can also trigger a need for assessment. We're not talking about using de-identified social determinants data to replace things like care and case management, but your decision support tool could trigger the need for care and case management. Thinking about clinical trial design, we talked about recommendations and about the desire for a more comprehensive and heterogeneous view of clinical trial participants. Using your analysis to determine what additional factors could be in consideration in real-world data could then create a feedback loop into things like clinical trial recruitment, thinking about the ways in which we recruit for a diverse candidate pool of clinical trial participants and maintain them in that trial in order to have a more diverse view of the end result. That could factor into things like site selection as well as into support for clinical trials going forward. And all of these are thinking about how the end result of real-world data and real-world evidence isn't an end result at all. It's a feedback loop into the business purposes, into designing and planning for the next phase of either a clinical trial or product development. And it's about really driving the business forward. So in kind of final conclusion here, when we think about efficacy and effectiveness, we think about the observations that happen within a clinical trial and the ways that real-world data brings more ability to rapidly and affordably assess effectiveness of products. I think it's important, again, to go back to this whole person view. What are we evaluating against if we don't understand more about the factors in that population? And if we can't help to expand the lens through which we view the patient and their experience. And just wanted to say thank you for your time. And with that, I think Lori is on the line.
I am. So, Emily, I think if you want to be seen on camera, I think you have to stop sharing your screen.
Yep.
If not, don't worry about it. But I wanted to thank you so much for the presentation. It was fantastic. Audience members, some have actually started already bringing up questions. But before we jump into it, I wanted to say that I have been alerted that there was some slides that were blurry and that we are going to be sending out a recording to assist with any of our audience members that want to see the clear slides. So let's go ahead and start with our first question. What is the deterministic way that Jane Smith and Jane Jones are linked?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So the LexisNexis data solutions that I talked about at the top of the presentation are fully identified solutions in the market today. So we solve for problems around patient matching and patient identity resolution. That's a kind of core part of our business within healthcare and really other individual identity solutions outside of healthcare as well. And what we have done in this solution is take a lens for a de-identified solution that puts that referential data at the backbone by creating a token on top of that, the combinations of PII in addition to that token, so that we can see that Emily Mortimer in Minnesota today is the same individual as Emily Mortimer in Pennsylvania a year ago. So the backbone of this really comes down to the fact that we have a long history of building that identified data solution, and we are deploying it now in a de-identified manner.
Thank you so much. Our next question. How can you leverage social determinants of health in a identified use case?
Thank you. Yeah, another great question. So for anyone who's familiar with work in things like population health or care and case management, I can see why this question might be top of mind, right? So the idea there is that you are intervening in an identified patient's experience to help improve and manage their care. What we've done here is sort of a natural evolution on that and on the de-identified approach to tokenization, which is to say, how can I take the insights that I have on the identified individual and either mask them or combine them in such a way that they create indicators of barriers to care, but that they are not creating a risk of re-identification. So there's a big difference between saying, in the example I gave here, right, that Jane Jones was divorced on a certain day, and saying, Jane Jones may be at risk for social isolation. Those are two different things, and they come with a very different level of information and risk for re-identification. So we've gone through the process of expert determination to package up that product in such a way that re-identification risk is mitigated and that we can add those insights into de-identified use cases.
Thank you. Our next question. How have you evaluated the performance of your token compared to first generation tokens?
Thank you. I mentioned in one of the slides about some results that we did that led to determining we had over a 20% improvement. And I'm thinking that's the question that the commenter is asking about. In that case, we were looking at historic claims data, which I think is a great example here because it's data that we all have familiarity with, and we understand why it might be a little bit messy, right? So it's a data feed that had not been cleaned or managed the way that, say, a health system's data might be. And it was used with different increments of history to apply a token based only on the observed input data on that exact claim form, or to link to the referential data and apply a token using the LexisNexis patient-centric token approach. By doing that and testing the different scenarios, we found improvements across the board, but the largest improvements were seen when we looked at a longer history of medical claims. And the longest one that we examined was about 5 years. Of course, if you were putting together a long history or a patient journey like we talked about today, you'd be looking at even more history than that, and the impact of that duplication could be even greater.
Our next question, and thank you for that answer. Are the use cases for your data limited to research?
That's another great question. So we talked a lot about the different solutions, and I've mentioned a few times now about social determinants playing a role in care management and case management. Today, we have various approvals for our products based on the data elements that are in question. So I think it's fair to start with the ones that are maybe potentially the most sensitive. So for our social determinants of health data, it's important that that solution is leveraged in a way that it does not create either a barrier to care or potentially like setting increased costs for an individual. So when we deploy that solution, we talk a lot with our customers about the ways in which it is used to expand care, to improve treatment, rather than to create, like potentially selecting a patient population who has lower barriers to care, for instance. We have other data assets like our deceased data that have a few restrictions, but that are primarily able to be leveraged for most use cases other than marketing. Marketing is generally the way that we divide up the approvals on the LexisNexis data assets. And then in addition, we have medical claims, which are available to be used for a few different use cases, and that can include like physician identification and marketing adjacent use cases.
Fantastic. Well, I'm afraid that we've run out of time. I'd also like to thank today Emily Mortimer again for that wonderful presentation, and to our sponsor, LexisNexis Risk Solutions, for making this event possible. Lastly, on behalf of LexisNexis Risk Solutions and Informa Pharma Intelligence, we hope that you have a productive remainder of the day And the recording will be available, I believe, within 48 hours. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.